Welcome to Watchtower History. The August 1st, 2001 Watchtower has an article called Your Right to Believe, which mentions the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The title of the article is Your Right to Believe, and it does ask some very interesting questions. On the next page, it asks the question, why do you believe what you believe? These are all important questions for Jehovah's Witnesses to ask based on all of this history that we've shared so far. But what's interesting is, knowing what we know now, after laying out all of this evidence, how Rutherford's anti-Semitism was rooted in the Populist Party and their conspiracy theories, all the way back from his politics with Williams Jennings Bryan, who he campaigned for years, and how his anti-Semitism was associated with the Henry Ford's racist ideology and his republishing of the protocols, and how some Watchtower writers had said Henry Ford was right about the Jews, and that statement that Ford ought to read Rutherford's work, Vindication, since there would be many things in it he would like. Knowing that these and some of these other conspiracy theories that Watchtower was incorporating into their theology at the time, now knowing all of these things, then the cover story has a very, very interesting question, because it asks, is there a sound basis for your beliefs? And these are all very important questions for Jehovah's Witnesses to ask after seeing all of this evidence.
And the most ironic, oddest part of that is using that and as an example of what do you believe, why do you believe? Of all things they show as an example, it's what started their religion. I mean, you couldn't plan that if you tried.
I remember when we were originally researching this, I had all these questions. Why did he say this about Ford? Why did he say this? Why did he say that? I couldn't quite put it all together, but it connected for you. And you said, oh, that's what Rutherford did. He built a religion out of these conspiracy theories and his politics. The cover of this magazine asks that perfect question. Is there a sound basis for your beliefs? Knowing that Watchtower's replacement theology is based in these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and all of these are forgeries, is there really a sound basis for Watchtower doctrine?
So now they told you to research and investigate and for yourself in past articles to find out if everything is true. And now they're asking you, what do you believe? So now that you've watched and researched, more or less, we've kind of laid out in quite a diagram, quite a chart, what the origin, the dates, times, places, uncounted evidence that was put on the screen for all this. And if anyone can think it's coincidental or it's just trumped up or something, you really need to reevaluate your core belief and what you're thinking and how you think, even probably. Yeah, I can't believe they actually bring up in that article they're bringing up in their own article about what you believe and why you should believe it, using the very articles of the foundation of the religion itself. You can't make it up. They just, you almost wonder if the only conspiracy going on is that they know what they're doing and they're rubbing it in your nose with an article like that right in your face. I don't know what to think.
I think it's more ironic and even more sad, more disconcerting that they don't really know. From all of our research, we know that they really don't know their history all that well. And who's ever suggested what we're suggesting? Has anyone suggested this in the past? Nobody. Even Penton, who wrote the Jehovah's Witness history book, Apocalypse Delayed, and also Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich, even Penton said he was thunderstruck by what we found through these connections that we've made historically and by all these thousands of slides and documentation that we've put together on the subject. I think it's more depressing that they pointed out the protocols here and asked these questions in this article, not realizing that it's part of the foundation for what Rutherford was teaching. Returning now all the way back to our stand firm and back down discussions that kicked off this roadmap series, which started a couple of years ago on September 9th, 2022. We mentioned Garbe, Roble, and other apologists for the Jehovah's Witnesses who've attempted to defend the actions and words of Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses during that period, including attempting to go as far as claiming that the Jehovah's Witnesses were not anti-Semitic at all, nor were the words in the periodicals and radio programs. Penton mentions this in his Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich, Sectarian Politics Under Persecution. Penton says, with regard to Garbe's statement that since the witnesses were not racists, they could not be anti-Semitic, we can only gape at his apparent lack of knowledge of the history of anti-Semitism. Non-racist anti-Semitism existed as long ago as the ancient Persian Empire. This is evident in the biblical book of Esther. It was certainly present at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century before Christ. It existed in both pre-Christian and Christian Roman times. Many suggest that it is found in the New Testament and in the writings of the post-apostolic fathers of the Christian church. It was present in many medieval societies and resulted in pogroms and Jewish edicts. The Jews were driven from England under Edward I in 1270, and from France under Philip the Fair in 1306, from Castile under Isabella the Catholic in 1492, and from Portugal under Mansell I in 1496. Martin Luther was thoroughly bigoted in his remarks about the Jews, and Shakespeare has given us a remarkably anti-Semitic view of the Merchant of Venice, with his desire for a pound of flesh. There was the terrible anti-Semitism of the Spanish Inquisition and that of Eastern Europe over the centuries. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this spirit of hostility towards the Jews continued for religious reasons, especially in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox countries. The Dreyfus case in France was certainly a case in point, as was the circulation of the bogus Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, and wild takes to the effect that Jews used the blood of Christian children to make Passover matzos. Significantly, even up to the eve of the Second World War, Catholic clerics and lay organizations in Quebec regularly petitioned the Canadian government to bar German Jewish refugees from Canada. Garbe's statement is absolutely incorrect, as we've shown on the channel for the past couple of years. The anti-Semitism ran deep and deep enough that they included it in the artwork in the periodicals, books, booklets, and even the calendars. What Garbe and Roble attempted to do was to define their own idea of anti-Semitism and base their argument on their own perception, rather than the actual words that were spoken, written, and published. The official United States government definition of anti-Semitism contains the following. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. And this was exactly what Judge Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses were doing in their periodicals, as we have shown in this roadmap series. There are multiple occasions in the literature of the Jehovah's Witnesses where they rightfully call out the Protocols of Zion as a forgery. As we have shown, the Jehovah's Witnesses were accused by the Nazis as having a part in the Protocols of Zion simply because the earlier Watchtower movement had been Zionists. Under Rutherford's presidency, the witnesses went to the exact anti-Semitic opposite, to the point they promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in their publications and radio programs, and they even included anti-Semitic artwork to suggest those ideas. In 1935, in the Golden Age, in 2 issues, they spoke about the Protocols of Zion in the September 11th and September 25th, 1935 issues. In the trial at Bern, evidence was produced that the so-called Protocols of Zion, an alleged scheme of the Jews for a world supergovernment, were the work of a Russian writer named Nilus, and consisted in 170 passages of plagiarisms from an essay written by the French author Maurice Joly in 1864, entitled A Dialogue in Hades Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. The Jews never had anything to do with these protocols, yet it was because of these that the Nazi persecutions in Germany were begun and carried on with such bitterness. Efforts to prove that the Jews had discussed these protocols at the First Zionist Congress at Basel in 1897 were proved to be false. 2 stenographers who attended all the sessions testified that the published report of the Basel proceedings was correct in every detail, and that the subject of the protocols was not even mentioned. The other article says, at an official trial at Bern, Switzerland, the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion were declared to be forgeries, ridiculous nonsense, and clearly not authentic. At the trial, one of the Nazi leaders from Germany tried to prove the protocols genuine, and also tried to prove Jehovah's Witnesses connected with them. He wound up by making himself a laughingstock. The 1936 Yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses mentions this as well, stating that the Nazis accused the witnesses of openly set as their aim the establishment of world rule by Israel. While this is denied by the Jehovah's Witnesses, the truth is that many Christians and evangelicals have suggested this idea as well from Scripture. The yearbook says, in November of last year, Bern was a scene of a unique and very interesting court case, that of the Protocols of Zion, which created quite a sensation. Upon the proposal of the defendants, the case was interrupted and resumed again in April of this year. A new expert witness was summoned, the German Lieutenant Colonel Fleischhauer, owner of the U-Bodung Publishing House and manager of the Weltendist World Service. And the evidence presented by Fleischhauer, which lasted for days, among other slanderous remarks, he stated that the Bible Students Organization have openly said as their aim the establishment of world rule by Israel. Thereby, Fleischhauer misinterpreted the activity of Jehovah's Witnesses in such an unheard of way that we felt it necessary to protest and accuse him of using misleading Jesuit methods. Whereupon Fleischhauer entered complaint against us, out of which a case is now pending. It is known throughout the world that the Bern Court declared that these protocols of Zion to be plagiarized and trash. Mention having been made in this case of the activity of Jehovah's Witnesses, the attention of the public far and wide was drawn upon Jehovah, and thus a great witness was given. And again, while this is denied, the truth is, like many Christians and evangelicals suggest, the idea is that Christianized Jews will be a part of a government of all Christians during the millennium.
What is the purpose of the 1,000-year reign of Christ? We're going to answer that question. You can also discover more on gotquestions.org. The millennium, aka the millennial kingdom, is the 1,000-year reign of Jesus after the tribulation and before the great white throne judgment of the wicked. During the millennium, Jesus will reign as king over Israel and all the nations of the world. The world will live in peace. Satan will be bound, and at the beginning, everyone will worship God. The purpose of the 1,000-year reign is to fulfill various covenants God made with the world. The Palestinian covenant. God has already fulfilled the personal aspects of the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham did go to the promised land, had many descendants, and was the forefather of many nations. Joshua led the Israelites to claim ownership of the promised land. But Israel has never possessed the specific boundaries that God promised. Not even Solomon's reign covered this particular area. In addition, the covenant God made with Abraham was that his descendants would have the land forever. Even today, Israel doesn't reach the boundaries God laid out. The Davidic covenant. God's covenant with David was that his line would never die out and that David's heir would sit on the throne of Israel forever. Biblical scholars agree that Jesus is the fulfillment of this covenant. His genealogy is given for both his adoptive father and his mother. The Jews understood this when they laid down palm branches as Jesus rode into Jerusalem, but they didn't understand. The nature of Jesus' work was for the new covenant, not for the Davidic covenant. The 1,000-year reign will be the beginning of Jesus' reign over Israel and the earth. The new covenant. The work of the new covenant, Jesus' death and resurrection to reconcile hearts to God, has already been accomplished, but we have not yet seen the complete fulfillment. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. You shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. This covenant does not mean that every Jew will be saved, but it does mean that Israel as a nation will worship their Messiah. All of the Old Testament prophets who spoke of this covenant said it will be fulfilled in the future. From their time on, Israel has yet to be an independent nation that worshiped its Messiah. They will be in the 1,000-year reign of Christ.
In the December 22nd, 1956 Awake magazine, there's an article, Jewish Persecution in Modern Times. At present, there is more anti-Semitism in the United States than in any other English-speaking land. Some 100 hate sheets regularly pour out anti-Jewish propaganda featuring the forged protocols of the elders of Zion, and especially a speech purported to have been made by Benjamin Franklin attacking the Jews, which authoritative historians have shown to be a forgery. Attacks upon Jews, both physical and by propaganda, continue to be made in Mexico, in Central and in South American lands. Jewish persecution throughout the centuries is such a towering tragedy that the mind cannot fully comprehend it. Since it was engaged in primarily by professed Christians, it is no wonder that many Jews feel an antipathy toward anything claiming to be Christian. The persecutions of Jews suffered bear grim testimony to the accuracy of the biblical warning as to what the Jews could expect if they went contrary to their maker, Jehovah God. Leviticus 26, 14-33. At the same time, it should impress them with the need of putting their trust not in silver and gold, nor in men and human agencies, but solely in Jehovah God. And so this article is very interesting because it attacks Christians for being anti-Semitic. It attacks the protocols of the elders of Zion and then turns around and makes the same exact claims and accusations as the protocols and the Christians that they're trying to discredit. In the October 9th, 1935 Golden Age, there's an article that talks about this, and it states, tragically, while calling out what they termed the fascism of papacy and claiming the protocols were a forgery, the author of the Golden Age article states that they received a copy of the Gentile Front, Nazi periodical listing American Jews in influencing government. The Supreme Court, Roosevelt's administration, and New Deal as being controlled by communistic Jews, as well as Jews running New York City, which sounds very much like Rutherford's letter to Hitler, where he mentioned a proverb that the Jews own New York. But terribly, this ends with stating the protocols of Zion are a forgery, while at the same time repeating the ideas from the protocols about the Jews and ending the article claiming that the Jews are money lovers. Granted, but they are not pig-headed wild beasts. The article says, all know that the press of the Roman Catholic hierarchy claims for the Pope the paternity of the New Deal. Mr. Coughlin declares that he read to Mr. Roosevelt the Pope's plans for just such a New Deal. The only thing that stopped the New Deal was the United States Constitution. The Pope hopes to put that out of the way, and a great campaign to destroy the Constitution and do away with the states' rights is now underway, so that papal fascism in the United States may become a stark reality. Meantime, there has been received in this office a copy of the Gentile Front, showing the strange cooperation with this scheme of very able American Jews, among whom are listed Bernard M. Baruch, Donald R. Richburg, Professor Felix Frankfurter, Judge Samuel I. Roseman, Henry Morgenthau Sr., Henry Morgenthau Jr., Professor Rex Tugwell, Mordecai Ezekiel, Edward A. Philaine, Francis Perkins, Harold S. Ikes, Samuel Untermeyer, Joseph B. Eastman, Samuel Dickstein, and many others. On the other side of the story is the fact that two of the United States Supreme Court justices, Louis D. Brandeis and Benjamin N. Cardozo, are said to be Jews, and their opinions help to kill the New Deal. The probable fact is that the reason why there are so many Jews in prominent places in the national government and in the New York state government is that there are so many able Jews in New York City, which city is, in fact, the largest Jewish city in the world. The governor of New York State, Herbert H. Lehman, is a Jew, and 9 out of the 10 New York State Supreme Court justices for Manhattan and the Bronx are Jews. The Gentile Front asserts that in the New Deal at Washington, 85% of the advisory and official positions are held by Jews, and that of the Russian communistic setup, composed of 554 members, all are Jews, but less than 20. The Gentile Front seems to be Nazi propaganda. It maintains the so-called protocols of Zion are of Jewish origin, despite the fact that this has been proved false wherever the courts have looked into it. Nothing could be more devilishly narrow-minded, more fiendish, more contemptible than the so-called New Germany to which the Gentile Front looks up and upon which the Golden Age looks down with loathing inexpressible. The Jews are money lovers, granted, but they are not pig-headed wild beasts. So again, at the same time, denouncing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from American Nazis, they promote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in the Golden Age. And in the October 4th, 1939 Consolation is an article, Smokescreen, in 2 parts. And it's a lot about Father Coughlin, who we spoke about many times on the channel already. It talks about Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic campaign. It says, no man in public life ever told more lies or got caught at them more quickly than Coughlin did when he started his lying campaign against the Jews, and that right in the midst of their horrible sufferings in Germany. He published the so-called Protocols of Zion, which all now know to be forgeries. And so this statement shows that the Jehovah's Witnesses understood Father Coughlin's magazine and radio program were based on the Protocols of Zion and criticize him for it. But as we've shown in our Roadmap series, the Jehovah's Witnesses were quick to call others out as anti-Semitic while claiming exactly the same anti-Semitic ideas at the same time. Coughlin reprinted it from Henry Ford. Henry Ford influenced both Rutherford and Hitler. Hitler called Henry Ford his inspiration. Hitler mentions him in Mein Kampf. The Golden Age asked Henry Ford to read Judge Rutherford's writings because they would find in it many things they would like. Other Watchtower publications said that Henry Ford was right about the Jews. How distasteful and ignorant are these statements of the Jehovah's Witnesses while at the same time promoting exactly the same things? Now, as we've shown, not only did Jews question Henry Ford's retraction of his anti-Semitic conspiracies, but many in the public press did as well. A decade later, Ford had no issues at all accepting the German Cross Medal from the Nazis for his influence on the Nazi Party and Hitler's stance towards the Jews. Many were calling out Henry Ford for his anti-Semitism. Yet, as we saw the Nation of Islam's comments about Ford and his anti-Semitism, they praised Ford for his anti-Semitism, calling him a great man, with the exact words that Adolf Hitler said about Ford. As we showed, the Nation of Islam was influenced by the writings and radio programs of Judge Rutherford, and they picked up the same anti-Semitism from Rutherford. How Garbe, Roble, or other Jehovah's Witness apologists can claim that there was no anti-Semitism, while even groups that picked up anti-Semitism from the Jehovah's Witnesses, is further evidence that the statements of these apologists is without foundation. As we have proven with all of the documentary evidence and artwork from the Watchtower's periodicals, proves the evidence for the anti-Semitism of the Jehovah's Witnesses is overwhelming. As we have documented further, Rutherford campaigned for the Populist Party and William Jennings Bryan, who he idolized. Bryan similarly did what Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses did in calling out Henry Ford for reprinting the Protocols of Zion, while at the same time, the Bryanites, the Populist Party, was spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about international Jewish globalist bankers, commercial Jews, which, like the protocols, were also forgeries, as we have shown in this series. In the book, A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan, Michael Kazin says, a growing number of Americans prayed to a Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Jewish God. But religious diversity had never bothered Bryan before, and he didn't protest it now. In fact, he frequently condemned the sin of religious prejudice. Supporters got scolded for alleging a papist conspiracy, and Bryan attacked Henry Ford for reprinting the anti-Semitic fraud, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in his Dearborn newspaper. He also accepted several invitations to speak at synagogues. After one such talk at a Miami temple, Libby Friedlander, a true daughter of Israel, praised his sermon on King David as far superior to the insincere prattle of her own rabbi back in Brooklyn. And finally, Michael Kazin's other book, The Populist Persuasion and American History, states the following similar ideas about the Populist Party. In speaking about Father Coughlin, who himself was a populist, just like Henry Ford, it says, "The pastor of Royal Oak was doubtless sincere in distinguishing between two types of Jews, just like Rutherford did as well in his early years, or many evangelicals do as well today, such as Pat Robertson of the 700 Club did frequently." It continues talking about the distinguishing between two types of Jews. It fit in with his general affection for Manichaean categories. But his foot soldiers and groups like the Christian Front were not particularly concerned with theological distinctions. In Brooklyn and the Bronx, bands of Coughlinite youths smashed the windows of Jewish-owned stores without inquiring into the beliefs of their proprietors. Sellers of social justice routinely used the crudest of anti-Semitic slogans to hawk their wares. On occasion, the paper published letters from readers whose fearful wrath was unchecked by considerations of spiritual doctrine. One such reader, who signed his letter JAB, wrote from Brooklyn in March of 1939 to oppose letting Jewish refugees enter the country. "Jews have been booted out of Europe for making a near debacle of civilization. Shall we accept this vast pro-communistic Jew swarm as America's ruling and owning caste, or fight it and drive it forth, or suffer physical extinction at its hands?" A kind of populism animated the horrific challenge. Since the late 19th century, most American anti-Semites had, like Coughlin, identified Jews as both non-productive manipulators of other people's money and the carriers of decadent radical doctrines from abroad. JAB did not hold Jews responsible for all the nation's problems, but his assumption that they could be nothing but a rapacious elite paralleled the arguments. Tom Watson had made to justify the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915, and Henry Ford had circulated in his notorious 1922 publication, The International Jew. Hitler himself defined Jews as a naturally parasitic race that gained positions of power in order to strip ordinary Germans of their hard-earned material resources and cultural cohesion. In the United States, however, Coughlin's anti-Semitism was a populism of fools. While 42% of Catholics, but only 19% of Protestants, told Gallup pollsters in late 1938 that they supported the priest, the Bolshevik Jew was failing as a mobilizing device. In New Deal America, a politics tightly yoked to a monastic conspiracy theory appealed mainly to the desperate and disorganized. The type of people who wrote bloody, chiliastic letters to social justice after it began serializing the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. At a time when most national figures, whether in politics, labor, or business, were lauding the ideals of ethnic pluralism and grassroots democracy, at least for whites, the tribal animosities Coughlin was stirring seemed anachronistic, even though in private, many Americans continued to grumble about the Jews. Ironically, as another world war began, the priest whose national popularity had once signified the end of calumny that Catholics were foreign agents was best known for accusing Jews of the same thing. So instead of trying to build a strong anti-war and anti-communist movement, Coughlin had to spend most of his time defending himself against verbal assaults from all directions. His supporters were active in many local chapters of the America First Committee, organized in 1940 to keep the United States out of war. But their presence embarrassed national leaders of the group and helped to stigmatize it as a haven for anti-Semites. Meanwhile, the number of stations willing to carry the priest's addresses dwindled to a handful. Finally, in 1941, Archbishop Edward Mooney of Detroit who had previously been wary of alienating devout Coughlinites, ordered the radio priest to stop his broadcasts for good. The next spring, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Mooney, at the behest of the United States Attorney General Francis Biddle, also instructed Social Justice to cease publication. Coughlin, dutiful son of the church, immediately complied. Until his death, a quarter century later, he remained pastor of the Shrine of the Little Flower. His superiors forbade any attempt at a national comeback. Charles Coughlin's descent into anti-Semitism and pro-fascism has tended to shape his entire political image. Living as we do in the unending aftermath of the Holocaust, it remains essential to understand how a cranky fixation on international money changers and their red allies could lead to a beguiling egoist to apologize for monsters. Knowing that Coughlin in the late 1930s could not have predicted the final solution only slightly mitigates his role in portraying the Nazis as worthy men who had something to teach Americans who felt their government had abandoned them. Yet before he retreated to that noxious bunker, the radio priest had advanced a populism whose movement did not expire with the destruction of Berlin and the revelations of Auschwitz.
You nailed it. That, and when you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses that you encounter, and you always encounter one, it's very ironic that when you really start, after they're done telling you about a wonderful world and the basic and the real milk and watered down, lukewarm things that they're teaching, you start asking them questions about, well, how did you become how did the temple get cleansed? How is that a trumpet? And you have to literally teach them their religion before you could have a discussion about their religion with them. And then ironically, a lot of them by that time are like, oh, they're thinking it sounds weird. They don't want to talk to you anymore. And in cognitive dissonance, they'll go out back to doing what they were doing. Again, you don't want to break up your family. You don't want to rock the boat. It's sad. It's sad is a real good word for it.
And as we've shown in our various trumpet blast discussions, Rutherford was basically saying every Bible story and prophecy is about Watchtower after 1914, 1918, 1919. And since he's taking the lead, it's really all about him because they're all of his ideas.
Yeah. After I kicked out the editorial committee, I'm the Watchtower.
And he took out the editorial committee in the very article where he says, I don't want to appear egotistical, but then he proceeds to take Revelation 12 and applies it egotistically. Everything is about him, including the 1260 days that goes right to the 1922 Cedar Point Convention, to the very day, to the very hour, to the very exact talk which Rutherford gave. The ADV, advertise, 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 which started the change in Watchtower interpretation forever going forward, suggesting that it was literally all about him and his advertised campaign.
And when it was fact-checked, he forgot the leap years and lied about 10 days of when he got out of prison. Per a Watchtower 10 years article that quoted the actual day that they got out of prison.
If you haven't seen it already, be sure to see our replacement theology discussion. Will the real Jehovah's Witnesses please stand up? Because it really clarifies these points and will show all of the evidence for Rutherford's replacement theology very specifically. So another tie to Watchtower and Rutherford's anti-Semitism was the famous 7 trumpet blasts that were the foundation for Watchtower's and are the foundation for Watchtower's interpretation on the book of Revelation. Those 7 trumpet blasts through the 1920s at each of those important conventions. Those 7 trumpet blasts that supposedly are the evidence that they're the chosen organization. But when you But when you look at those trumpet blast discussions, when you look at the lectures Rutherford's giving, when you look at the message that he's giving, what message is it? It's tied into anti-Semitism. That's when he's building his new Watchtower doctrine. That's when he's building his new ideas, and he's borrowing those ideas from Ford. He's borrowing those ideas from the Populist Party and Bryan and the anti-Semitism, and he's making that the very foundation of his religion. So if now we go and we look at each of those 7 trumpet blasts. Let's see what they say. Proclamation, a challenge to world leaders. That the international conferences at Paris, Washington, Genoa, and The Hague, participated in by the financiers and statesmen and approved by the denominational clergy of the world, held for the purpose, as announced, of establishing peace on earth, have failed to bring forth the desired results. That Satan, long the god of this world, has deceived the statesmen, financiers, and the clergy by inducting them to believe that by international agreement or other combined efforts, they can bring the desire of all nations. That, on the contrary, during the World War, the clergy of these various church denominations were disloyal to the Lord Jesus Christ in this, that they wrongfully united with big business and big politicians to further the World War. A version of Rutherford's lecture, Millions Now Living Will Never Die, was published on the back page of the challenge. And in it, it says, Satan's organization, composed of big business, big politicians, and big preachers, is bad enough. But a wild, senseless mob without sense of justice and bereft of reason is 1,000 times worse. Such now menaces all nations. I see a mighty upheaval, a veritable avalanche of blood and fire, starting in Russia and sweeping over the earth. It was provoked by the profiteers who have exploited and robbed the people, by the politicians who have misrepresented the people, and by the preachers who have deceived and misled the people, all directed and operated by the devil's mastermind. Now Satan and the loosened demons have also seized the minds of the radical element of humanity, and they are going to extremes.
And so you can see trumpet 1, the same terminology of we showed the pattern going on, that the clergy, they're being punished and disloyal to Jesus because they united with big business. Who's big business?
When you look at the message that he's giving, as Paul said, he's talking about the financiers. He's talking about the big business. He's talking about big business,
religion
causing the World War. Well, who was he describing as big business? These international Jewish bankers. These international Jewish bankers that Henry Ford was pointing at. These international Jewish bankers that Hitler was pointing at. This anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that basically provoked and encouraged what the Nazis did in World War II. And Rutherford's using that as the foundation for his first trumpet blast. Trumpet blast number 2. Los Angeles, California, August 25th, 1923. And this was Rutherford's proclamation, a warning to all Christians. What is Rutherford warning Christians about? Proclamation, a warning to all Christians. Those who pretend to be Christians but do not believe in the Bible as God's inspired word of truth, who repudiate the doctrines of the fall of man and his redemption through the blood of Jesus Christ, which class is made up of apostate clergymen and the principal of their flocks, who are worldly men of strong financial and political influence, which class exercised the controlling influence and power in the denominational organizations. While posing as the representatives of the Prince of Peace, they have sanctified war, openly advised, encouraged, and advocated the same, and by appealing to the patriotism of the people, have induced them to engage in war. They have wrongfully preached the men into the trenches, caused them to fight and die, have filled the land with a host of widows and orphans, and thereby increase the sorrow and suffering of mankind. Rutherford's lecture, The World's Crisis, was published on the back page of the warning. As a result of the World War, the nations are bankrupt and the flower of humanity has gone into the grave. Selfishness, fraud, profiteering, and hatred are ever on the increase, making the burdens of humanity unbearable. The doctrines or messages of these three evil organizations may be briefly summed up as follows. A great league or world court is the one way to safeguard the rights of the people. All must support our religious system, which has joined hands with big financiers, profiteers, and big politicians. And this was the convention where he gave his famous World Crisis lecture. And in the World Crisis lecture, published on the back page of the warning, this is what they distributed to the public. This is what was published in the newspapers. Rutherford again uses anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That was the zeitgeist of the time. That was popularized through Henry Ford in those days.
Now remember,
and Rutherford's going with that. Go ahead.
As a reminder, he's taking all this fulfillment. What does the book of Revelation describe Armageddon being? The financial, the ecclesiastical, and the religious system. That is, and he, in his mind, is causing this Armageddon upon them by giving trumpet blasts, warning them of what's going to happen to them. He's claiming to be doing this. And as you read the articles, once again, what's it talk about? The religious system joined hands with the big financiers and politicians. So he's including this self-prophecy from Revelation into his religion, into his trumpet blasts that he himself is giving.
And think about what he's doing here. He's crying against the League of Nations. He mentions a great league or world court because he believes a new world order has to come where the Antichrist is going to take over the world, just like his old Baptist theology. And if these financiers that are behind the league in Rutherford's thinking, in Ford's thinking, in Hitler's thinking, these Jewish financiers and this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, if they're behind it, then that's what we should be aware of. But he's not realizing, but we didn't realize until we went through all of this background, all of this history in our roadmap discussion, that when Rutherford uses these phrases, he's talking about these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, one after the other. Ecclesiastics indicted. We present and charge that Satan formed a conspiracy for the purpose of keeping the people in ignorance. Unfaithful preachers, conscienceless profiteers, and unscrupulous politicians have entered into said conspiracy. Unfaithful preachers have willingly made commercial giants and professional politicians the principal of their flocks. We present and charge that the clergy have joined in said conspiracy. They have, together with their co-conspirators, have endorsed the League of Nations, declaring their allegiance to the devil. They have advocated and sanctified war. Rutherford's lecture, Civilization Doomed, was published with the indictment. Commerce and politics have both played their part. Greed for gain and power has turned legitimate commerce into wicked profiteering. The commercial giants traffic in human blood as they do in the inanimate products of the earth. Those composing the nations within the meaning of the scriptures are financiers, politicians, and clergy, because combined they rule the people. The clergy sought and brought into the church the big commercial giants, the great politicians, and other men of worldly influence, and made them the principal of their flock, those who are already under the control of Satan. The clergy go hand in hand with profiteers and politicians in their fraudulent attempts to control the people under various parts, leagues, and other forms of government. In these messages, Rutherford talks about the commercial giants again, these professional politicians, unfaithful preachers. And we've seen in our roadmap discussion already where he links in the Jews to these unfaithful preachers. He links in the Catholics and the Protestants as well.
And he even goes saying it's the scripture saying that, meaning the scriptures are composing the nation within the meaning of the scriptures are financiers, politicians, and clergy combined rule the people. So he's once again throwing this revelation in with his anti-Semitism.
And again, mentioning the League of Nations as well. The League of Nations, which he's tied into these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about big business, where he mentions it over and over and over again. This is part of his Anglo-American powers, controlled by the League of Nations.
A beast he had to fight that was against him.
Yeah.
That he was looking for help from. And why would you look for help from a beast if Jehovah is protecting you and you're his chosen? Would you need to rely on a major wing of Satan's organization to help you? That goes back to our discussion. Do you remember?
So what you're talking about is our earlier discussion where Rutherford had to appeal to the League of Nations when the Nazis were taking their literature. Rutherford had to rely upon the League. He asked the League for help, and yet at the same time he's asking the League for help, he's calling them the beast. He's making them a part of his Anglo-American world powers. And this Anglo-American world powers, he's tying into his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, just like Ford did, just like the Nazis did, just like Coughlin did. Message of hope. World powers, science and philosophy, commerce and religion have each in turn offered their respective remedies for man's relief. In the name and under the guise of democracy, these combine in offering their joint and several powers to meet the requirements of man. Intrigue, duplicity, and trickery are freely resorted to by the political and commercial powers. The results are that the peoples are smarting under the oppressive weight of commercial profiteers, and their allies have lost faith in their political leaders and no longer have respect for the religionists who misled them. Being guided by the false light of such an ungodly and unholy alliance, the peoples have fallen into darkness. They are like lost sheep, scattered upon the mountaintops without a shepherd, and are without food and shelter, and are made the prey of wild beasts. Rutherford's lecture, A Standard for the People, was published with the message of hope. Why the world has reached a great crisis, and why there is such a strife of tongues concerning politics, commerce, religious, and social affairs is important to all. Every person who thinks should want to know. The enemy of mankind is Satan. His organization includes diverse and numerous agencies through which he operates. The world powers, the political factors, the commercial giants, the scientists, the philosophers, and the clergy, both Catholic and Protestant, have united and now hold themselves forth as a light of the world. And if you remember, in the last few weeks, where we discussed Watchtower's quack medical science and how it was influenced by the anti-Semitism, Rutherford's mentioning it here as well, where he says that the scientists are part of his conspiracy that he thought was controlling and ruling the world.
And that leads us into, ironically, the fourth trumpet as a message of hope. After all this in Indianapolis, Indiana, on August 29th, 1925, that fourth trumpet, a message of hope through all this. And let's guess who can give the hope. But was it really a message of hope when you break it down? It was a message of doom unless you join his organization.
That's what we called it when we did our trumpet blast discussion on that subject. It wasn't a message of hope. It was a message of hate. And what hate is there in this message of hope? What hate is in there? What hate is found there on his Standard for the People lecture, again, published on the backside of the message of hope? These anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, yet again.
And again, showing the pattern, the world powers, political, commercial giants. Now he throws in scientists, philosophers, back to the clergy, both Catholic and Protestant. They have all united to hold themselves as the light of the world. Now, by saying that, if you joined his organization, he had the light of the world for you.
And remember,
Just sell the books.
Yeah. And remember, when he's talking about these commercial powers, he's always talking about commercial Jews, big business Jews. He keeps linking the Jews in all of his other lectures, these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in all these other lectures. And so he's already introducing this early on in the early 1920s. But in the 1930s, when he states very, very specifically, he gets more blatant, more open on his anti-Semitism, and he mentions the Jews specifically by name. But as we saw in his lecture in 1920 to the Jews at the Hippodrome, when he talks about big business, the commercial bankers, he's mentioning these anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy theories to the Jews themselves. And so he was already pushing those ideas, albeit softly, in the early 1920s through these trumpet blasts. It's much more blatant during the 1930s at the height of the Nazi rise to power. Trumpet 5. A testimony to the rulers of the world. World powers have been organized and carried on for the purpose of ruling and controlling the peoples. They are the result of the combined efforts of the commercial, political, and ecclesiastical leaders, are influenced and dominated by Satan. Contrary to the word of God, the commercial, political, and ecclesiastical rulers attempted to stabilize the world and keep the peoples under control by adopting that makeshift, which is called the League of Nations. Rutherford's lecture, World Powers Addressed, was published with a testimony to the rulers of the world. In the councils of the learned rulers of the world, the burning questions are, why do the nations continue in distress and perplexity? What remedy can be applied that will stabilize the world? All of these powers are indicated under the symbol of beast. The evident reason for this is that all these world powers have been harsh, ferocious, and oppressive. The commercial element is cold, calculating, military, and harsh. The political element is suave, diplomatic, and faithless. The religious element is, and always has been, sanctimonious, hypocritical, fraudulent, and seductive. These world powers have even designated themselves under the symbol of beast. The British Empire has adopted the lion as its symbol. The commercial and political elements constituting the military of the world powers in substance said, to stabilize the world, we must have a compact of nations in which all nations shall agree that our council shall govern and control them. The governing factors of the world powers, particularly the ecclesiastical element, by reason of claiming that these world powers rule by divine right. No one will attempt to deny that the British world power is the earthly agency that was responsible for the formation of the League of Nations Compact. The British Empire is the very bulwark thereof. Let Britain withdraw, and there will be no League of Nations. And in this lecture, he's doing exactly the same thing he did in all the other ones. He's bringing in his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the League of Nations, about the commercial element, about commercial, political, and ecclesiastical rulers. He even says these world powers have even designated themselves under the symbol of beast. The British Empire has adopted the lion as its symbol. And so he's adding his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and making them a part of his Anglo-American world powers, a part of his new beast that he's creating based on these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we've been showing through this entire roadmap series.
And again, the words, the efforts of the commercial, which of course is the Jewish cabal, political and ecclesiastical leaders are influenced and dominated by Satan, the same pattern. And he's melding it into now something even bigger, a beast that is going to attack him eventually.
Now remember, this is 1926. This is very, very early on in the new ideas that Rutherford's presenting. And notice in the first paragraph of his World Powers Address lecture, he states something very interesting that sounds very much like the subject that we've been pointing to in this particular part of the discussion. He says, in the councils of the learned rulers of the world. Well, what was his hero, Henry Ford, proposing and suggesting at the time? The protocols of the learned elders of Zion, who he thought were commercial Jews conspiring to be rulers of the world. And he also says here that no one will attempt to deny that the British world power is the earthly agency that was responsible for the formation of the League of Nations Compact. The British Empire is the very bulwark thereof. Let Britain withdraw, and there will be no League of Nations.
And you see as it's unfolding, remember, England was the powerhouse. America became the powerhouse after World War II, the might of the United States. So then he went into, once again, looked at horns, look at this, looked at that, and combined America and Britain as this dual agency as part of this League of Nations, and combining them all and creating the beast through that. But as you see in 26, as he says, England was the powerhouse that he's mainly talking about the League of Nations. Now, the United Nations, again, a whole other aspect, and the Anglo-American dual world power.
And remember, when he's talking about these commercial Jews, these big business Jews, they even mention in Watchtower publications, and it wasn't just Rutherford. If you remember, we talked about Hartshorne, who said that Henry Ford was right about the Rothschilds. He said that Henry Ford was right about the Jews. Remember that in the Golden Ages, that Henry Ford should read Judge Rutherford's book, Vindication. Why? Because they're repeating the same exact things that Henry Ford was pushing at that time, the same exact anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the same exact anti-Semitic conspiracy theories Coughlin picked up, the same exact anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that the Nazis picked up. And look what happened to the Jews. Look what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses, simply because the Nazis thought that Jehovah's Witnesses were Zionists as they were in the early days.
And like the advertise, what was he looking for? A plug from Henry Ford to mention his work in the Dearborn Independent? I mean, why would you make a statement like that knowing what Henry Ford is doing and saying? A plug? Advertise? And that everybody sees the Dearborn Independent. Oh, I got to look at the Awake now, the Watchtower. Where is it coming from?
And the very fact that Henry Ford disliked the Bible student for the same reason the Nazis didn't, because they were Zionists. The Dearborn Independent claimed that the Jews were selling Bible student literature in those early years. And Hitler picks up on the same exact thing. And when Rutherford writes to Hitler, he has to mention that very fact. Oh, we didn't take any money from the Jews. Why? Because he knew what Ford had said, and he knew
what they were being accused of.
Yeah, and he knew that the Nazis were accusing them of this because of what was in Ford's writings. They've been accused of that since the early 1920s by the Nazis, when Ford first published it. To the peoples of Christendom. The money power of the world has been concentrated into the hands of a few men called high financiers, and these in turn have corrupted the men who make and execute the laws of the nations. And the faithless clergy have voluntarily joined the forces with the high financiers and professional politicians, and that said unholy alliance constitutes the governing powers that rule the peoples. that the leaders of Christendom are amalgamating the common people with the military in order to make all the peoples a part of and subject to their great war machine, that the unjust laws of the common people, contrary to their own wishes, have been compelled to go to war against each other, resulting in great sorrow and suffering. Rutherford's lecture, Freedom for the Peoples, was published with To the Peoples of Christendom. God foretold that small minority would rule the great majority, that during that period of oppression and suffering for the peoples would desire freedom and a righteous government. He therefore caused his prophets to write concerning the present time. The three classes of men that make up these ruling powers are, to wit, high financiers called big business, professional politicians called statesmen, and the orthodox clergy called religious leaders who manufacture and dispense religion. High financiers are few in number, but great in power. They produce no wealth, but obtain it through fraud and deceit practiced upon the peoples, and then use it for their own wicked pleasure and to oppress the multitudes and keep them under control. The so-called statesmen jobs depend upon obedience to high finance. In fact, high finance is the bulwark of organized Christianity, so-called, and its power and influence have corrupted the politicians of every nation. The corrupting hand of big business has been laid upon men in high political positions and corrupted every department of every government of Christendom. The peoples go through a form of election supposedly to elect their public servants, but most of these political statesmen are elected and controlled by the defiling influence of big business. Even the courts are corrupted by big business. When big business is pitted against the people have no show in the courts. When big business desires to increase its holdings and war seems to be advantageous to its selfish interests, it does not hesitate to provoke war between the peoples of different nations. At the bidding of big finance, the politicians enact the necessary conscription laws which compel the common people from all parts of Christendom to kill each other, while the representatives of big business and their allies hide in their holes. When the war is over, millions of the common people sleep in the dust of the earth, and within the brief period of blood and carnage, there has been born another crop of millionaires, and there follow greater lawlessness amongst the politicians than ever before. The conscienceless politicians defiled by big business and the oppressors of the people constitute a part of organized Christianity, or Christendom, so called, that rule and control the peoples. A few ultra-selfish men constitute big business, and they control the commerce of the world. They do it by the power of money unjustly wronged from the hands of multitudes of toilers. They control the elections because the politicians elected to office enact and enforce such laws as they want. They own and control the public press and publish only what they desire the peoples to read. The radio, which God has brought to light for the benefit of the peoples, the same selfish interest is now seeking control. The same power controls the clergy and uses them for selfish purposes. Now, the Unholy Alliance is pursuing a systematic campaign to amalgamate the common people of all Christendom into great military organizations. The false slogan of the World War was that it would make the world safe for democracy. Big business and its allies now hope to hold the common people in subjection by making them a part of the harsh and cruel war machine. And this was Rutherford's lecture, Freedom for the Peoples, which also became a booklet. And in this trumpet blast, he again points at the professional politicians, the high financiers.
And once again, in his trumpet blast, we go back to Revelation, the three classes, and it says word for word, the three classes of men that make up the ruling powers are high financiers, called big business. And if you know, business is in quotation, which when you put a quote around something, you're saying, okay, it's this, we're calling big business, but this is what it's representing. So the big business, once again, is the Jewish conspiracy theory, and finally politicians and clergy. So he's got it all once again in his sixth trumpet blast, that he is making the trumpets of Revelation. Now, doesn't Revelation actually say the angels are doing that? So now, angelic communication article. I mean, how he just pushes it for himself. Now, the work is guided by angels. So we didn't make it. The angels made it. I didn't make it. Cleverly disguised. But wait, you are making that. The angels didn't say what you're saying.
And if you remember, when they came up with that angelic communication concept, one of the conclusions that it led them to was, oh, we don't need the Holy Spirit any longer. And so they got rid of the Holy Spirit, only to bring it back somewhat quietly after Rutherford passed away. But this lecture to the public at this convention, in this trumpet blast, says very specifically, a few ultra-selfish men constitute big business. What did Rutherford write to Hitler in the Declaration of Facts? He called the Jews, the big business Jews, ultra-selfish men. This is a phrase that he repeated often. This is a phrase that he used. This is where Rutherford was going. This is what he was building his religion out of through the 1920s and 1930s. He created an entire new religion out of these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the same exact ones that the Nazis believed. Declaration against Satan and for Jehovah. Jehovah delegated to his son Lucifer the authority to be the overseer of man. That Lucifer became disloyal, rebelled against God, and caused man to fall away from righteousness. Satan the devil has caused strife amongst the nations and is responsible for all the cruel wars, wicked murders, all heinous crimes, and other corrupt acts have been committed. Rutherford's lecture, Ruler for the People, was published with Declaration against Satan and for Jehovah. From time to time, the Jews sought to kill Jesus, and in every instance, they were acting under the influence of Satan the devil. Satan thinks he can defeat Jehovah and therefore prepares for the great battle of Armageddon. He musters all of his forces, both visible and invisible. He blinds the minds of statesmen, leading them to believe that they have the ability to establish a desirable government and that they may be aided in so doing by heeding the advice of an apostate and dishonest clergy. He induces the selfish financiers to believe that their power is irresistible and that they can corrupt the rulers and oppress the people at will. Thus, the forces of evil are arrayed against God and his anointed. Why is it that a few men can organize great corporations with unlimited wealth and power and brazenly use them to corrupt the officials of the government and to oppress the people? Why is it that the official government gives special favors to the ultra-rich while a deaf ear is turned to the cries of the oppressed? Why does one of these corporations, to wit, the National Broadcasting Company, form an alliance with the clergy, and they together attempt to determine what the people shall hear or not hear concerning religion in the Bible? Why is it that the clergy oppose and persecute those who tell the people the truth and at the same time furnish a sanctimonious smokescreen behind which cruel corporations and conscienceless politicians carry on their nefarious work?
Once again, this goes back to, if you start to think about this, declaration against Satan for Jehovah. Okay. Now, who's vindicating Jehovah's name? Okay. If you go back to our vindicating Jehovah's name, where he changes it from Jehovah vindicating his name himself through the unbelieving Israel, he in writing claiming he's doing it for Jehovah. Here's his vindication. He's doing it for Jehovah. Again, who's doing it? Not Jehovah, Rutherford, fulfilling Bible prophecy. So his, in its own way, kind of like in the Bible itself in Revelation, he makes the seventh trumpet one of the major trumpets of all of them through this, and once again tying in all his own personal thoughts and viewpoints from anti-Semitism.
And remember, this is exactly right after his Birth of the Nation article, where he says, oh, we're the spiritual Jews. And he's already starting to replace Israel because remember his 1925 failure. That 1925 year that he thought the Jews were going to be back in their homeland. He thought that the Jews were going to blow a literal trumpet and all the dead were going to come back to life. Didn't happen the way that Rutherford thought. So he said, what's a spiritual trumpet? And we're the spiritual Jews and we're fulfilling it spiritually. So how do we fulfill it spiritually? By proclaiming Jehovah's name. Since the real Jews can't do it because they're not in their land, we're in the spiritual land. That's how we're doing it. And so that's where Rutherford is again bringing in his replacement theology, which is based on his anti-Semitism. His anti-Semitism that he had years before he was even a member of, before he was a member of Watchtower.
And as he says, in every instance, talking about the Jews, killing Jesus and all that, in every instance, the Jews were acting under the influence of Satan the devil. So you're saying that Satan's controlling the Jews, which Satan is controlling the world, the big business end of it, through the Jews. So you're really tying that all in together, and he's locking it in. You can't get yourself out of that hole. And once again, now you're back to Armageddon, his version of Armageddon. Okay? Satan thinks he can defeat Jehovah and therefore prepares for the great battle of Armageddon. Getting back, I don't know if we discussed it on any of our videos or just we roughly talked about it. Satan thinking he could defeat Jehovah. Does Satan think he could defeat Jehovah? He was there, according to the Bible and according to your belief. Satan was created afterward. He would have to know the power of God and couldn't even begin to think he could defeat him. He's just challenging him in one aspect. So that statement itself, once again, he's taking the people. Hey, Satan thinks he could defeat Jehovah. You come on our side. We're the side that's going to defeat Satan. And he's creating, once again, his own battle of Armageddon the way he thinks it's going to be.
Now, remember, in our vindication discussion, when we mentioned this particular idea about Satan, about Watchtower saying that they thought Satan could defeat Jehovah, this new vindication concept that Rutherford's bringing up is basically making Jehovah out to be a weakling. He's making Jehovah out to be someone who doesn't plan really well. Oh, Adam and Eve sinned because Satan's trying to defeat me. Plan A is not going to work. Now we need a plan B. And so if you remember in our discussion, we mentioned when Rutherford and Watchtower was trying to pass a new bill in Congress for freedom of speech. And they call up the president of NBC and CBS to Congress to question them if they're part of this global conspiracy, this global anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And they, of course, they have to say no. And the person, and as we showed, the very person that Watchtower was using to propose this bill was somebody who had read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to Congress. Somebody who believed the same thing that the Nazis did, just like Rutherford, just like Watchtower.
Why would you choose a person to defend you in such a way? You have to believe them. You have to believe what they're saying is true. So how could that goes back to that fairly recent, was it in the Wake or Watchtower about the Protocols of Zion being how they're well, wait, here's your freedom of speech bill through the big debates through Congress. Here it was for the Protocols of Zion. So while they're pointing the finger there, once again, it's always the spotlight always comes back upon them and their own teachings and origins and foundations. and trumpet blasts.
And notice what he says here clearly. He says the National Broadcasting Company forms an alliance with the clergy. Who's he claiming that they're forming an alliance with? Again, tied back into these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that Ford was pushing, that the Jews were controlling the press. He also asks the question, why is it that the clergy oppose and persecute those who tell the people the truth, and at the same time furnish a sanctimonious smokescreen behind which cruel corporations and conscienceless politicians carry on their nefarious work?
And who is being persecuted again?
And what exactly is nefarious? Aren't these very ideas the foundation for the nefarious work that the Nazis did, that Hitler used? And yet Rutherford is using these ideas as a foundation for the new religion that he's building?
You've got to be able to not have a hatred toward the religion, yet have a knowledge of it, and yet understand where it came from without being biased toward it to really expose it for what it is.
And the sad part is, I don't think they realize the origins of a lot of these ideas. They're so far removed from those old years. They don't realize
Not
the
only
foundation.
literally removed, because they don't publish Rutherford's work on their article, on their publications in online that you could get at JW.org. They got rid of it. So there's got to be some level of understanding about all this, because they don't want to put it up there. They don't want anyone to see it for themselves, and then they attack you if you look it up on your own.
And how should we think of the Jehovah's Witnesses? Personally, I feel pity for them, because they're in such a high control organization, based on these very anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, based on policies of shunning, based on policies of the no blood transfusion, which themselves have caused too many deaths in Watchtower. And if they don't, how are their families going to hold together? Look what happened in Michael's story. How very abhorrent and sad and depressing that was, that he couldn't live because of how his family was treating him with the shunning policy.
What you just said reminds me of a comment we had on this particular Rutherford Roadmap discussion from one of the viewers, asking us if we could do summary of the videos, quick things. And I was thinking about the way he was thinking entirely. And I just said, well, there's a lot of information. We're really trying to prove a point so no one could say his comeback. What was interesting, you don't understand. You could be watching. You don't have 2 hours to watch. Your family's watching you. They're watching you. You got to make the most out of your time if you're getting it. And he quoted an example of different families getting shot. And it's like, man, it is so sad that they, like you said, they're allowed to do it. And it's so encouraging little by little that the governments are looking, well, wait, even human rights, it's beyond human rights. It's a biblical right, if you really want to get technical, to just, as the Bible says, treat him as just another person of the world. What would you do with another person in the world? Hello, how are you? You don't invite them in your home and eat with them if they're blaspheming God and starting a fight. But that doesn't mean you bump into them in line at a grocery store. Hey, Joe, how you doing? Haven't seen you. I hope all's well with the family. It's just their whole mentality of it all is, like you said, getting back to it, controlling.
And as this suggestion was, one of our ideas based on this is to take everything we know about Rutherford so far and some new things, and we want to summarize all of these stories that we've told, to tell a short version of all of these stories and add in some new information here and there, and share some new accusations against Rutherford, not just what Moyle and Salter accused him of, but some other brand new information that we've recently discovered.